Legends whisper of a creature lurking in the deep forests, taller than any man, stronger than any beast. Bigfoot has remained a mystery, a fleeting shadow in the wilderness. But the legend takes a darker turn when sightings lead to disappearances and hikers vanish without a trace. What if Bigfoot isn't just watching? What if it's hunting? Dive into these mysterious stories and discover the chilling truth. Humboldt County, California, was known for its towering redwoods, mist-covered valleys, and the eerie silence blanketed its remote logging roads. On March 17, 2025, the wilderness became the site of an incident so bizarre that even seasoned authorities struggled to explain it. James Carter had spent the past 3 years designing and building his custom off-road truck, a $500,000 beast equipped with reinforced suspension, military-grade tires, and a chassis built to withstand anything nature could throw at it. He had invited 4 close friends, Brandon McKinney, Victor Suarez, Evan Hensley, and Ryan Douglas, for a private test run deep into the woods, far from prying eyes and paved roads. The group departed from Eureka in the late afternoon, eager to put the truck through its paces. Carter, who prided himself on control, drove confidently, maneuvering effortlessly through the winding dirt paths. The truck roared as it climbed steep hills and tore through thick mud, the sheer power beneath them exhilarating. Yet, as dusk settled, an uneasy tension filled the air. They had reached an abandoned logging trail that the forest had long reclaimed. Towering redwoods lined both sides of the road, their immense trunks casting elongated shadows under the waning sunlight. The deeper they drove, the more the feeling of isolation grew. Something was off. The usual chorus of crickets and distant howls was absent. The silence was suffocating. Sitting in the passenger seat, Victor was the first to notice the movement. Something massive darted between the trees, keeping pace with the truck. At first they assumed it was a bear, but the shape was all wrong. Taller, leaner, impossibly fast. Brandon, sitting in the back, pointed at something just ahead. A pair of reflective eyes glowed in the dark, high above the ground. Carter slowed the truck, gripping the wheel tighter. Evan peered out the window, his breath shallow. The answer came in the form of a deafening crash. The truck lurched violently to the side as if struck by a wrecking ball. Metal screeched. The reinforced steel groaned under pressure. Carter slammed his foot on the accelerator, but before the vehicle could move, it was yanked backward with an impossible force. The truck flipped, the world turned upside down as glass shattered and bodies slammed against steel. The roll cage barely held. When the dust settled, Carter groaned, pain shooting through his ribs. He could hear Victor wheezing beside him, the others silent. Then, heavy breathing outside the wreckage sent a chill through his spine. Something moved, deliberate, slow, heavy. Footsteps crunched against the debris-strewn road. Carter tried to turn his head, but the pain kept him frozen. Through the shattered windshield, he saw it. A towering silhouette loomed just beyond the broken vehicle. Broad shoulders, thick fur, and eyes that gleamed with unnatural intelligence. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something in between, something ancient. It exuded raw power, the kind that defied logic. Victor whimpered beside him, still alive but terrified beyond words. The thing moved closer, placing a massive hand on the crumpled hood. Metal shrieked under its grip. Then, without warning, it stepped back, disappearing into the darkness of the trees as quickly as it had arrived. Carter's vision blurred, his body succumbing to the pain. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was the faint outline of enormous footprints in the dirt. When authorities arrived the next morning, the truck was barely recognizable, a heap of twisted steel and shattered glass. All 5 passengers were found dead, their bodies mangled in ways that didn't align with a simple crash. Official reports cited a bear attack, but nothing added up. No claw marks, no bite wounds, only brute force injuries, as if something had physically crushed them. Daniel Cole, a veteran forest ranger, was the first on the scene. He looked at the footprints around the wreckage and knew what he was seeing. He had spent his entire career patrolling these woods, hearing whispers from locals, collecting stories from those who claimed to have seen something impossible. He looked toward the trees, where the shadows stretched deep into the forest's heart, and for just a moment, he thought he saw movement. something impossibly tall watching from the gloom. But when he turned back, it was gone. Cole never spoke about what he saw that day. The official report remained unchanged, a tragic accident, an unfortunate encounter with a bear. But those who knew the forest and had heard the stories passed down for generations understood the truth. Something was out there, and it was watching. As the weeks passed, the wreckage was removed, and the case faded from public attention. However, local hunters and outdoorsmen began to avoid that stretch of forest. Some claimed they heard unnatural howls at night, unlike any animal they could recognize. Others spoke of trees swaying without wind and of an oppressive presence that followed them. One particular hunter, Leonard "Lenny" Caldwell, had lived in the woods. He didn't believe in legends, dismissing stories of Bigfoot and cryptids as nonsense. But curiosity got the better of him. One evening, armed with a high-powered rifle and night vision goggles, he set out to investigate the site where Carter's truck had been found. Lenny hiked for hours before reaching the clearing. The ground still bore the scars of the crash, and strange indentations in the dirt sent a shiver up his spine. As he crouched to inspect them, a branch snapped behind him. He whirled around, his rifle raised. Nothing, just trees, their trunks illuminated in the green glow of his goggles. Then he saw it, a shape, massive and unmoving, blending perfectly with the darkness. Its eyes caught the light of his goggles, reflecting an eerie glow. Lenny's breath hitched. He had faced mountain lions, bears, and even territorial moose, but this was different. This was watching him, studying him. Slowly, Lenny backed away, his finger tense on the trigger. But he knew, deep down, that bullets wouldn't stop something like this. He turned, walked, ran, and never stopped until he reached his truck. He drove straight home, parked, and never returned to those woods again. Days later, he sold his entire hunting arsenal and moved out of Humboldt County. The forest remained silent as if nothing had ever happened, but those who knew better understood that something ancient still roamed beneath the redwoods, watching, waiting, and perhaps deciding who was allowed to leave and who wasn't. The Klondike Highway in Yukon is a brutal stretch of road, cutting through the frozen wilderness with little room for error. In the dead of winter, the temperature plummets to lethal levels, and snowstorms erase any trace of the path ahead. In 1989, this remote stretch bore witness to an unsettling incident that those who heard the story refused to travel alone at night ever again. Richard Lawson and Tom Grady were seasoned travelers, used to the brutal conditions of the North. They had been making the journey together for years, knowing every turn and hazard the Klondike Highway had to offer. Their latest trek was routine, a supply run bound for Dawson City. The usual chatter among travelers had been sparse that night. The howling wind drowned out the normal banter. Around midnight, Lawson's voice had crackled over the radio, urgent and strained, as he reported that something massive was blocking the road ahead. He had sounded confused, describing it as too large to be a moose, but unable to make out what it was through the storm. Then silence followed. Dave McAllister, another traveler about 30 minutes behind them, had pressed the mic button, trying to reach them. He had called out their names, asking if they were all right, but there had been no response. McAllister had pushed forward, anxiety gnawing at him. When he reached their last known location, his headlights had illuminated a nightmare. Their supplies were scattered across the snow, as if something had torn through them. The area was eerily silent, save for the wind cutting through the trees. There had been no sign of a struggle, no indication of what had happened. Just massive, deep impressions in the snow leading away from the site, footprints far too large for any human. McAllister, despite his instincts screaming at him to flee, had stepped into the cold, flashlight in hand. The freezing air had bitten into his exposed skin as he searched the area. The remains of their gear had been eerily undisturbed, except for a thermos of coffee still sitting upright, steam curling from its opening as if Lawson and Grady had simply vanished. Then, a sound had emerged from the tree line, a deep, guttural exhale, followed by the unmistakable crack of branches snapping under something massive. McAllister had turned his flashlight toward the source and seen movement, a towering silhouette shifting just beyond the beam's reach. A pair of reflective eyes had caught the light, then another and another. McAllister had not waited to see more. He had run, stumbling in the snow as the sensation of being watched clawed at his back. He had barely made it back to safety, though deep down, he had known no barrier would stop whatever was out there. As he fled, his last glimpse into the trees had revealed something impossibly large, covered in thick, matted fur, watching him leave. When the authorities arrived, they found their abandoned belongings, but no sign of Lawson or Grady. The official report had cited a rock slide. Despite no displaced boulders or debris, the case had been quietly closed, and whispers of the encounter had spread among those who frequented the Klondike Highway. Some had said the creatures that roamed the Yukon were remnants of an ancient world hidden in the endless wilderness. Others had claimed the road cut through something's territory, something that didn't take kindly to trespassers. To this day, those who pass through do so with caution, hoping not to hear Lawson's last words crackling through the static. Strange occurrences had marked the weeks following the disappearance of Lawson and Grady along that section of the highway. Other travelers had reported seeing large, shadowy figures lurking just beyond their vision, moving at unnatural speeds between the trees. Some had even claimed that, on particularly stormy nights, they had heard faint, unintelligible voices over their radios, as if someone, perhaps Lawson or Grady, was still out there, calling for help. The experience had haunted McAllister. He had tried to rationalize it, telling himself that exhaustion and the tricks of light in the snowstorm had played with his mind. But deep down, he had known better. He had spent too many years in the wilderness to mistake something ordinary for what he had seen that night. One evening, a few months later, he had decided to return to the site, not alone. He had convinced another traveler, Henry Blake, to accompany him. Blake had been skeptical but curious, and both men had come equipped with rifles, though neither had truly believed they would be of any use. They had arrived just after dusk, stepping out into the freezing air. The remains of the previous encounter had long been cleared, but the sense of unease had remained. The snow had been fresh, untouched, except for the occasional trail of an animal. Then they found the footprints. Unlike any animal tracks either had seen before, these impressions had been enormous, spaced too far apart for a human stride. The weight of whatever had left them had compacted the snow deep into the frozen earth. The tracks had led from the trees to the side of the road, directly to the spot where Lawson and Grady had vanished. And then they had vanished, as if whatever had made them had simply disappeared. Blake had muttered that they should leave, and McAllister had agreed. As they had turned to head back, a sound had echoed from the trees, a deep, guttural growl, followed by something moving fast through the underbrush. The trees had swayed, but there had been no wind. The two men had run, reaching safety just as something massive had crashed through the tree line. Neither had turned to look. They had fled without hesitation, refusing to stop until they had reached the next outpost, miles away. Blake had never spoken of that night again. McAllister had abandoned his travels soon after, unwilling to take his chances anymore. The whispers about that stretch of the Klondike Highway only grew over time. Some locals reported hearing rhythmic knocking sounds echoing through the trees, too structured to be random, but too distant to trace. Others found deep claw marks gouged into tree trunks at impossible heights, and some claimed that wildlife had started to avoid the area altogether, as if sensing something unnatural was sharing the forest with them. Over the years, the legend of the Yukon predator had grown. Some believed it was a relic of a time before man, an undiscovered giant of the wilderness. Others whispered that it was something else that didn't belong in this world. But one thing had remained consistent. Those who encountered it never spoke of it willingly, and those who had vanished were never found. To this day, some still claim that on the coldest, most desolate nights, if you listen closely, you can hear Lawson's last transmission, cutting through the static, warning those who dare to travel the Klondike Highway alone. The Ural Mountains in Russia have long been shrouded in mystery, stretching across the landscape like the spine of an ancient beast. These frozen peaks are home to some of the harshest, most unforgiving terrain on Earth. In the winter of 1973, deep within this remote wilderness, a military transport convoy met a fate so chilling that the Soviet government buried the details for decades. On a frigid January night, A military transport truck carrying classified equipment rumbled along an icy road, its headlights casting a weak glow against the encroaching darkness. The two men inside, Sergeant Anatoly Petrov and Corporal Sergei Ivanov, were hardened soldiers, accustomed to the brutal Russian winters. Their orders had been simple: transport the cargo to an isolated research station deep in the mountains. But as they pressed forward into the endless white expanse, something began to feel off. Petrov, gripping the steering wheel with gloved hands, muttered about how unnatural the silence was. Adjusting his rifle in his lap, Ivanov agreed, noting that they had not seen so much as a rabbit for hours. The thick pine forest that lined the road loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The road had been poorly maintained, but their truck was built to handle rough conditions. The engine hummed steadily, its low rumble the only sound in the frozen stillness. Yet even that felt muted, as if the air around them was pressing in. Then, without warning, the truck jerked violently. The front tires had dipped into something, sending the entire vehicle lurching forward. Petrov fought the wheel, keeping them from skidding off the road. Cursing under his breath, he stopped the truck and climbed out to investigate. He exhaled, watching his breath fog in the cold air before dissipating into nothingness. The snow-covered road had been disturbed by deep impressions, footprints, but far too large to belong to any human. They stretched from the tree line across the road and vanished into the darkness beyond the reach of the truck's headlights. Ivanov joined him, shining his flashlight on the prints. The beam wavered slightly in his unsteady grip. He muttered that no bear left tracks like that, his voice barely above a whisper. The two men exchanged uneasy glances before returning to the truck. They radioed their base, reporting they had encountered strange tracks and requesting guidance. Static was their only response. Ivanov tried again, adjusting the frequency, but his knuckles were white around the radio dial. Still, nothing but the endless hiss of dead air. Then, the sound came. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees, so low it vibrated in their chests. Petrov instinctively reached for his sidearm, scanning the darkness. Ivanov gripped his rifle, eyes wide. The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching unbearably as the two men remained frozen in place, their breath shallow, their senses alert to the unseen presence beyond the trees. Before either could react, something slammed into the side of the truck, with enough force to tilt the massive vehicle onto two wheels. The reinforced steel groaned under the pressure before the truck crashed back onto all fours. Petrov barely scrambled into the driver's seat when the passenger door was wrenched open. Ivanov screamed as he was yanked from the cab by something massive, disappearing into the night. Petrov reached for his weapon, but before he could even lift it, an immense, hairy arm smashed through the windshield. He barely registered the moment before he was flung from the truck like a rag doll. His body collided with a tree. The breath was knocked from his lungs. Dazed, he struggled to focus. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was a towering figure dragging Ivanov's limp body into the forest. When Petrov awoke, dawn had painted the sky in pale hues of blue and gray. His uniform was stiff with frozen blood, his body aching in ways he had never experienced. He forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming, and staggered back toward the truck. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through his battered ribs, but he ignored it, driven by the desperate need to understand what had happened. The vehicle was ruined. The doors had been torn clean off, and the steel twisted beyond recognition. Snow had filled the cabin. The windshield was reduced to jagged edges. The cargo bay had been ripped open, its contents scattered across the road like discarded scraps. The classified crates had been smashed, their contents strewn about. Whatever had attacked them had no interest in the cargo. Of Ivanov, there was no sign. Summoning the last of his strength, Petrov limped down the road, knowing his only chance was to find help before the cold claimed him. Hours later, he was discovered by a rescue team responding to the failed convoy's radio silence. He barely registered their voices, his thoughts consumed by the horror of what he had seen, the unshakable certainty that something unnatural had taken his comrade. The official report classified the event as an unidentified predator attack. The case was sealed, and Petrov was reassigned to a desk job far from the Ural Mountains. He never spoke of that night again, but the nightmares followed him wherever he went, haunting his sleep with visions of towering figures and the echoes of Ivanov's final scream. The locals, however, knew the truth. They had long spoken of the Menk, a massive ape-like creature said to roam the depths of the Russian wilderness. Few had ever seen it and lived to tell the tale, but the wreckage left behind on that lonely mountain road was proof enough. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and reminding all who entered its territory that they were trespassers in its world. Years later, whispers of the incident continued circulating among soldiers stationed near the Ural Mountains. Some claimed to have seen fleeting glimpses of massive dark shapes moving through the trees. Others reported hearing guttural howls at night, which were unnatural and unplaceable. Petrov lived the rest of his days in quiet seclusion. Occasionally, in the privacy of his small apartment in Moscow, he pulled out the faded report, his only proof that the nightmare had been real. The Soviet government had buried the truth, but Petrov knew better. He traced his fingers over the redacted lines, remembering every unspoken detail, knowing that the world would never be ready for what truly lurked in the frozen wilderness. Travelers crossing the remote mountain roads spoke of strange encounters, shadows too large to be human, deep footprints appearing in freshly fallen snow. The Menk remains a legend, but it was anything but a myth for those who have seen what lurks beyond the tree line. The wind howled through the valleys like the echoes of those who never returned, and the Menk still watched, waiting in the endless cold. The Amazon rainforest is a world unto itself, vast, ancient, and filled with secrets that have never been fully uncovered. The sheer density of its foliage swallows sound, its tangled pathways obscuring whatever moves within. It is a place of myths and legends, where reality and folklore blur. In 2005, a group of Brazilian loggers working deep within the forest came face to face with one of its most terrifying legends, and what they experienced ensured that none of them would ever return to that part of the jungle again. Diego Morales had been working in the rainforest for nearly a decade, hauling rare hardwood from the interior to distant sawmills. He knew the dangers: jaguars, venomous snakes, and the ever-present risk of getting lost, but nothing had prepared him for what happened that night. His work had taken him through some of the most remote rainforest stretches, where even the indigenous tribes refused to venture. The other workers had already left, leaving him to follow alone. The air was humid, and insects buzzed relentlessly around him. The forest was never truly silent, but an unnatural stillness settled over the area that night. It was the kind of quiet that signaled something was watching. It was supposed to be a routine journey, but as Morales moved along the trail, his lantern flickered, then dimmed. The oppressive darkness closed in around him. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sound was the rustling of the jungle, the whisper of unseen creatures shifting in the darkness. Morales cursed under his breath, adjusting the lantern. His fingers were slick with sweat. Everything seemed intact, yet the light refused to hold. Then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, not the deep, rolling sound of a jaguar, but something different, something wrong. Morales turned slowly, the dim glow of the lantern cutting through the dense undergrowth. His breath hitched as he saw the eyes, glowing red orbs, unblinking, watching him from the trees. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal he knew. He took a step back, heart hammering in his chest. The jungle erupted around him. Branches snapped like gunfire. Something massive moved between the trees, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Morales turned and bolted, his boots slipping in the damp soil. He ran blindly, lungs burning, the eerie red eyes still visible through the gaps in the foliage. His pulse pounded in his ears as the ground beneath him trembled. Then, a tremendous impact shook the earth. A force unlike anything he had ever felt sent him sprawling. He gasped, struggling to rise, his body trembling. Through the darkness, he saw a shadow moving, tall, impossibly broad, covered in matted fur. The red eyes burned like embers in the dark. His mind raced. He had heard the stories before. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the Mapinguari, a creature of legend, an ancient guardian of the rainforest. Some believed it was a giant sloth, others, a supernatural being that punished those who disrespected the land. Morales had always dismissed such tales as superstition, but now, trapped in the jungle with something enormous just beyond his reach, he wasn't so sure. The beast exhaled, a hot breath washing over him. It let out a deep, guttural sound, almost like a language, a low, rumbling vibration that sent shivers down Morales' spine. He felt something primal, something ancient in that sound, as if the creature were judging him. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stepped back. The jungle swallowed it once more. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. Morales remained where he was until dawn, too terrified to move. His hands ached from clenching the damp earth so tightly. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, he finally dared to stand. The area around him bore deep claw marks, and the ground, once soft with mud, was now dry and solid, as if the jungle had shifted overnight. When the workers returned at sunrise, they found Morales shaking and incoherent. His skin was clammy, eyes wide with something beyond exhaustion, pure, unfiltered terror. The other men looked around, their unease growing as they examined the disturbed earth. Authorities dismissed it as a jaguar attack, but the loggers knew better. Jaguars didn't leave hand-shaped impressions in the soil. Jaguars didn't shake the very ground, and jaguars certainly didn't have glowing red eyes. That section of the rainforest was abandoned soon after. The logging operation was shut down within weeks, and the company cited logistical issues. Though the workers knew the real reason, the locals whispered of the mapinguari, a creature of legend, tall, covered in thick fur, with glowing red eyes and a terrible, unearthly strength. Some believed it was a guardian of the forest, a spirit that punished those who took too much from the land. Morales never spoke of the encounter again. He left the logging industry shortly after and moved to a small town near the coast, far from the suffocating embrace of the jungle. But even in the safety of civilization, he found no peace. The nightmares followed him, visions of glowing red eyes watching from the darkness, of hot breath on his neck, of a voice that was not a voice speaking in tones he could never understand. He refused to return to the rainforest. Even years later, he declined when offered substantial money to work in the jungle once more. Some places, he said, were not meant for men to tread, and the mapinguari still watched, waiting for those who dared to disturb its home. The Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia, has long been a place of mystery. Thick eucalyptus forests stretch for miles, shrouded in mist and silence, concealing deep ravines and ancient caves that have never been fully explored. Rumors of the Yowie, a towering ape-like creature of Aboriginal legend, have persisted for generations. Most dismissed these stories as myths, but in 1996, one man learned firsthand that some legends refused to stay buried. Nathan Price had been a livestock transporter for over a decade, hauling sheep and cattle across Australia's rugged terrain. He was used to long, lonely drives through the outback, often navigating treacherous roads in the dead of night. He had heard the stories about strange encounters in the Blue Mountains, but never paid them any mind. That changed on a cold evening in August. He had been driving a full load of sheep through the winding mountain roads, his truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was empty, save for the occasional glint of animal eyes reflecting from the bush. It was supposed to be an uneventful drive, just another job like any other. Then, without warning, the truck lurched violently. Nathan barely managed to keep control as the massive vehicle skidded, tires struggling for traction on the gravel. Something had hit him, or he had hit something. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a shuddering stop. Heart pounding, he reached for his flashlight and climbed out. The front of the truck was intact. There was no sign of a collision, no fallen tree or kangaroo carcass. But something was wrong. The night was too quiet. The usual symphony of insects and nocturnal birds had vanished. The silence was absolute. Then he smelled it. A thick, musky odor hung in the air, something foul and animalistic. He had spent enough time on farms to recognize the scent of an animal nearby. But this was different, stronger, almost unnatural. Moving cautiously, he walked toward the trailer. What he saw made his stomach drop. The steel bars of the livestock transport, built to withstand the weight and force of full-grown cattle, were bent outward as if something had pulled them apart. Tufts of wool clung to the twisted metal. The sheep, every single one, were gone. Nathan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. No tracks were leading away from the truck, no sign of a struggle, no blood. It was as if the animals had simply vanished into the night. A branch snapped in the trees nearby. He turned sharply, flashlight beam sweeping across the underbrush. Something was watching him. He could feel it. Then he saw them, eyes low to the ground at first, then rising. The creature stood, towering above him, easily 7 feet tall. Its massive, hunched frame was covered in dark, matted hair. The dim light caught its face, something between man and beast, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence. Nathan didn't wait to see what it would do next. He ran. His boots pounded against the dirt road as he sprinted back to the cab, every instinct screaming at him to move faster. He could hear it behind him, heavy footfalls, unnaturally fast for something so large. His lungs burned as he reached the truck, yanking the door open and slamming it shut just as something massive crashed against the side. The entire truck shook from the impact. Nathan scrambled for the keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. The beast struck again, a deep, guttural growl reverberating through the cab. He forced the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. The headlights illuminated the creature in full. It was even larger than he had thought, its thick fur matted with dirt and debris. Its long arms hung low, ending in massive hands tipped with thick, blunt claws. Its mouth was partially open, revealing yellowed teeth, its breath steaming in the cold air. The thing took a step forward, seemingly unfazed by the blinding light. Nathan didn't hesitate. He threw the truck into gear and slammed on the accelerator. The tires spun momentarily before finding traction, and the massive vehicle lurched forward. The creature roared, lunging toward the truck, but Nathan swerved violently, sending the rear trailer fishtailing across the road. The impact was sudden. The truck slammed into something solid, a tree or the creature itself, before the wheels lifted off the ground. The world flipped upside down as the truck rolled, metal shrieking as it tumbled down a shallow ravine. When everything finally stopped, Nathan was upside down, still strapped into his seat, the shattered windshield revealing nothing but darkness beyond. For a long moment, he stayed still, listening. His entire body ached, but he was alive. Outside, the silence had returned. The creature was gone. It took him nearly an hour to crawl free from the wreckage. His right leg was sprained, and his ribs ached with every breath. Using what remained of his flashlight, he stumbled through the darkness, following the road in the hopes of finding help. When he reached a small roadside station at dawn, his mind was full of exhaustion and pain. The locals listened as he told his story, their faces pale with recognition. They knew what had happened. Others had seen it before. The Yowie was real. When authorities arrived at the wreckage, they dismissed the event as a simple accident. No mention was made of the deep claw marks found on the truck's exterior or the complete disappearance of the livestock. Nathan refused to stay in the area any longer. He sold his rig, left the transport business, and moved far away from the Blue Mountains. He never spoke of that night again. But those who travel the winding roads of the Blue Mountains at night still report strange sightings. Dark figures moving just beyond the reach of their headlights, strange howls echoing through the valleys, and the lingering feeling that something, somewhere, was watching. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across vast portions of the eastern United States, their thick forests hiding deep ravines, abandoned settlements, and secrets few dare to uncover. Among the locals of West Virginia, stories of strange encounters have persisted for centuries. Tales of shadowy figures, eerie sounds in the dead of night, and creatures that defy explanation. Most dismiss them as mere folklore. However, in 2012, tow driver Robert "Bobby" Hayes learned that some legends are real. Bobby had been working the late shift for over a decade, responding to stranded travelers along the lonely back roads of the Appalachian wilderness. It was an unforgiving job that required patience, a strong stomach, and a willingness to go through places where cell service was non-existent and help was was hours away. He had seen his fair share of accidents, met people in all states of desperation, and assisted in situations that made little sense, but nothing compared to what he encountered one autumn night in October. A call had come in just after midnight. Lenny Dawson had reported trouble on an isolated stretch of highway, claiming that something had torn his belongings apart. His voice had been frantic, his words slurred with either fear or exhaustion. Bobby had jotted down the location and set off, expecting to find yet another traveler who had underestimated the region's infamous wildlife. Probably a bear attack, he had told himself. It wouldn't have been the first time someone had panicked after running into one of the black bears that roamed these parts. The road was empty as Bobby walked, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dense fog that clung to the asphalt like a living thing. The silence was unnerving. Even the usual sounds of crickets and distant owls seemed absent. As he neared the coordinates, he slowed, scanning the roadside for any sign of Dawson. Then he saw it. Lenny's belongings were scattered across the ground, torn and strewn about. Nearby, the earth was disturbed, as if something massive had moved through. Bobby's instincts already screamed that something wasn't right. He gripped his flashlight tighter, the cold night air prickling his skin. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled his nostrils. He called out for Dawson, but there was no response. A dark trail of something, blood, he realized, led from the site into the thick underbrush. The sight sent a chill up his spine. He had dealt with emergencies before, but this looked like something else entirely, something violent. Then he heard it, a deep, guttural breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees just beyond his line of sight. Bobby turned his flashlight toward the sound, the beam shaking slightly in his grip. The woods were dense, the gnarled branches casting eerie shadows. For a moment, he saw nothing, just trees, endless and unmoving. Then, a branch snapped. A figure shifted in the darkness, just at the edge of his light, tall, broad-shouldered, too large to be human. Its eyes reflected the beam, twin points of pale light in the blackness. The moment stretched, the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, and then it moved. With unnatural speed, it stepped forward, its form now fully visible. It was covered in thick, matted fur, its arms unnaturally long, its fingers tipped with claws that gleamed in the dim light. Its face was neither fully human nor fully beast, its mouth slightly open, revealing sharp teeth. Bobby's breath caught in his throat. He didn't wait to see what it would do next. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the asphalt as something heavy crashed behind him. The sound of movement, fast and relentless, followed him as he sprinted. His heart hammered in his chest as he pushed himself forward, lungs burning. Only when he reached the next town did he finally stop. The authorities found Lenny Dawson's last known location the next morning. There was no trace of him, no footprints, no sign of where he had gone. The official report stated that he had likely wandered into the woods in a state of shock, possibly after a bear attack. But Bobby knew better. He quit his job not long after, moved out of state, never spoke of that night again. But those who lived near that stretch of road still talked about the thing in the woods, and those who walked through after dark knew better than to stop.